policy exchange event, it's marvellous to see so many sort of friendly faces in the audience. And I think having attended Labour conference now for 3 years on the trot, this is the first time I've ever been to a Labour conference where they're not only ahead in the polls, but comprehensively ahead in the polls, which makes all of the amazing discussions happening in fringe events, in conference halls at Labour conference more important than they've ever been. But it doesn't matter however many amazing ideas we come up with in conference, unless we have a machinery of government and a civil service that is up to the task of implementing the manifesto commitments of election-winning governments. It doesn't matter how great our rhetoric around this is. And that's why it's an absolute pleasure to have this event at Labour conference today and discuss an issue that sometimes might fly under the radar in some political discussions that we have. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our panel quickly, because I don't think that there are many people who are better equipped in this conference today to tell us about how we can reform and improve government for the 21st century. So to my left, we have Dame Meg Hillier, who is the chair of the Public Accounts Committee and the scourge of accounting officers up and down Whitehall. On Zoom, we have the only person who's perhaps more terrifying than getting the call saying that Meg Hillier would like to scrutinise you, is the call that comes and says that Gabriel Pogrund is planning to write a story about you. And so we have Gabriel Pogrund joining us on Zoom. We also have Lord Wood, who's a Labour peer, a fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, and a former shadow minister without portfolio, who in his various guises across the years has seen and led modernisation and reform movements across Whitehall. And we're also joined by Richard Lum, who's responsible for Newton, our partners today's central government practice. And if there's anyone who knows about embedding and delivering particularly digital reform, it's Richard. So it's a real pleasure to have everyone here today. Without further ado, I'm going to turn across and ask Meg to open us up. We're going to speak for around 4 or 5 minutes before we might have a little bit of panel discussion and then open it up to you on the floor. But I'd just like to ask you, Dame Meg, what do you think government is good at? What you think government is bad at? What perhaps we can learn from the various sort of initiatives that we did throughout the coronavirus pandemic, and what you think are the sort of key areas that an incoming Labour government might want to either reform entirely, improve what's happening, or sort of leave well alone, I think, which is also another option that's always open to civil service reformers. And to find out what really we can do to ensure that the civil service and government itself is up to delivering a Labour Party's manifesto commitments.
Well, thank you very much, Benjamin. And it's really important to discuss this, because we were hearing Rachel in the hall earlier. We've heard many others speak, and we'll hear more about the policies we want to introduce. But actually, it's nothing if we can't deliver them. And so that's where the civil service absolutely come in. So, let's just take your questions directly. So what are the civil servants good and bad at? Well, they're actually not too bad at turning policy ideas into a more fleshed out policy, but they're not usually as good at delivering it. And this is what my committee spends its time looking at. So week in, week out, we're looking at projects that have usually not delivered as well as they should have done. And we're constantly going back to government to tell them what we think needs to be done to improve that delivery. Because not only is it frustrating if you're the party in power not to have things delivered well, and it's frustrating for the citizen that's supposed to be receiving the service, but it's also extremely costly if a programme is massively delayed. So it's actually vital that we get a real our front bench have a real understanding of this when they go in for their first 100 days. What they're also quite good at is actually, as we saw in a crisis in the pandemic, there are a lot of people in the civil service, and they can quickly turn their hand to a lot of things, not always as brilliantly as some things, but there are surge teams now that, Liverpool actually is a good example, where you have a DWP based next door to passports, based next door to the immigration service, and when there's a surge in one area, they will send a team of people around, which is something which I want to touch on about skills in the civil service. But we have looked repeatedly, and I've been on the Public Accounts Committee now for 11 years, and I've been chair since 2015, and we keep banging on about skills in the civil service. So what they're not so good at is specialising. If you're, well, actually I suppose Stuart's a good example. If you're a highly qualified academic from Oxford, you do quite well in the civil service. You go in and you rise up the ranks quite quickly. However, if you're a specialist in digital, or if you're a specialist in some technical skill, you're not really going to become permanent secretary. And that is still the case, even though myself and my predecessor, Dame Margaret Hodge, have been banging on about this, among others, for a long time. Now, something that this government has done is to set 5-year terms on mandarins, and you'll have read, of course, about Sir Tom Scholar being sacked from the Treasury unceremoniously only just last week, a week or so ago, and that he had gone past his 5-year term, been reappointed, but was nevertheless sacked anyway. But that 5-year term can be quite, it was an aim by the Tories to make people more accountable, but actually it ended up meaning I know that there are some permanent secretary at least who's got a list on his wall with months up to the 5-year period. It's almost like they've got a deadline to reach, and there's a danger that we lose expertise because for all I knock mandarins and they all take it in good parts, but they haven't got much option when they're in front of me to take it in good part. But sometimes I point out, well, we often point out the lack of skills of certain types. They do understand politics and Whitehall, and there is an important need for that, to how to navigate around that. But on its own, it's not enough. And that Mandarin-style approach still means we've got very strong silos in government. So one of the things the Treasury's tried to do is encourage cross-government bids for spending reviews. And with us, every time we ask how many, it's 2 or 3. It's really small in number because departments don't want to give away their power and work together. And I've got plenty of examples, but in my few minutes, I won't be able to go through them all. But that machinery of government is so silo-driven, it is going to be a problem if we come in. And politicians, I always say this to officials, we have a breadth of vision, perhaps not a depth. We're not all brilliantly expert in lots of things, but we do cut across from the constituent we meet in their living room or on their doorstep and the issues that they raise with us at surgeries, all the way through how services are running in our area and the place setup that we see, what the impact on place of policies and the interaction of policies. We see that loud and clear, and that is too often not seen. And that's in a way, I suppose, the summary of what we try and do on the committee, apart from looking at the money, is saying, well, it's not effective because you're not seeing all those connections, and we see those loud and clear. The digital piece is really important, and if Labour gets in, we have to, I'm trying to get the civil service to embed in the idea that you cannot have digital as something that politicians deal with. It's got to be something, it's a 20-year programme, a lot of these. The Police National Database, the Police National Computer on 1970s architecture. We've got the biggest public sector IT reform programme in HMRC underway, the courts. I mean, every bit of government has got problems with digital, and only now they're beginning at the baby steps of having a proper strategy for dealing with it. And we have got to see that through if we were in government, because without that, we're going to have problems down the line. But it's not going to deliver massive dividends if we are in 2024 in that first term, even though some would become apparent. There are lots more. I mean, in the discussion, hopefully we'll get on to things like public appointments and some of the roles of ministers. But I think that the civil service needs, what we would need to do is actually, to pick up on your final point, if you go into government and you say, we're going to tear up the way the civil service works and start all over again, or as some have said, they're all a load of rubbish, they're not doing a good job, that is not the way to do it. We will need a strong and experienced civil service to deliver our policy agenda. So what we need to be clear is, as a party, to have a clear, focused agenda, a clear plan for the first 100 days, first year, first 3 years, first 5 years, and make sure that we're really clear about that. Underneath that, we could be working with trade unions and with certain bits of the civil service to look at how we can further embed the skills that are really necessary to do this. But I don't think a big bang approach saying it's all not working or it's not working the way we want it is going to deliver. And that is one of the challenges about reforming the civil service. It's never really going to be a top priority for an incoming government because the upheaval will be too great if you're also trying to deliver a policy agenda. So on that conundrum, I will pause because I'm sure we'll have plenty of discussion around that.
That's a brilliant introduction to the problem. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn next to Lord Woods, if that's okay. And I think one of the things that was slightly touched upon there was the role of ministers. Yeah. It'd be really interesting to hear Lord Woods' thoughts on that. But, greater specialisation, improving cross-government working. I mean, this all sounds much like the Fulton Committee report that was commissioned under a Labour government in the 1960s. So, I mean, what do you think Labour has to bring to this party, and how do you resolve that conundrum that Dame Meg highlighted right at the end?
We've got runs on the pound going back to the 60s, so why not go back to Fulton as well? We could do that. I mean, I basically, Meg said it, all the excellent things she said are the things I wanted to say. So I'll say what I was going to say anyway and pretend it's different, but it's not that different. But let me just say a little bit about, I want to say something about what the civil service is not to blame for, because particularly in the last few years, I think it's quite important to realise that political choices rather than incompetence of the civil service are behind a lot of the national fiascos that we face. I'm not saying that to get the civil service off the hook. I think it's important because the civil service has become politicised as an agent of politics in a way that's unbelievably, not just unfair, but incredibly unhelpful for us as a nation. Meg is right that a wholesale approach to reforming the civil service is really a red herring, because the marginal gains, even if you got it right, are very, very low for a massive amount of turmoil. Like all organisations, the civil service has similar problems to organisations we all work in all the walks of life are represented here. Retention problems, skills problems, organisation problems, ethos of professionalism issues. And like all organisations, it has problems of silos, like Meg mentioned, it has groupthink problems. These are all familiar issues in any organisation. Civil service has these as well. But it's nonsense, for example, to say that the civil service opposed Brexit. The civil servants want clear orders, and then they'll do what they're told. And their incentives inside organisations are to deliver on ministerial objectives and their bosses' objectives. That's what they do. Whether they like that. I have no doubt, by the way, that civil servants on average were massively against Brexit as a group of people. But the idea that they are sabotaging Brexit in the aftermath is pure finger in the air speculation, and it's a sort of slanderous thing to say, really. Similarly, the idea that economic mismanagement is to do with Treasury orthodoxy or the civil service. It's not, it's political choices. I mean, it's an interesting combination of things. Since New Labour took over, went into power 20 years ago, 25 years ago, whatever it is.
Too long.
Too long ago. Both parties have, until Liz Truss a few weeks ago, colluded in the idea of fierce scrutiny of public finances being the centrepiece of what government is about. That has been a political choice that first the Labour government made, for reasons we all know, and then Cameron and Osborne took on and sort of accelerated. And the whole infrastructure of the OBR, or the Office of Budget Responsibility, and the fierce scrutiny of the way public finances are inspected, the Treasury's empowerment to be the surveiller-in-chief of the way departments spend every penny, scrutinised in itself by Meg and other people in Parliament. All that entire system was a political choice that both parties have made. That has nothing to do with a sort of orthodoxy inside the Mandarin class that is obsessed with bean counting. In fact, if you think about the Treasury, in the two massive economic crises we've had in the last 20 years, 2008 when I was in number 10 with Gordon Brown, and COVID, you might argue we're about to enter a third one, but anyway, the Treasury has been incredibly fleet of foot and nimble and radical and prepared to spend unbelievable, eye-watering sums of money. The reason in general that the Treasury is opposed, and you're seeing it at the moment, I'm afraid, the reason in general that the Treasury is opposed to unfunded spending is because they know that public service cuts come in the wake of unfunded spending. That's the issue. So the Treasury, as long as taxes are raised to fund spending, they can be very big spenders. But what they worry about is markets punishing a government that makes spending promises they can't deliver, leading with a 3 or 4 month lag to massive public sector cuts. Because we know from history that's what happens again and again. So that's my apology for the Treasury, but it's not really about the Treasury, it's about a mistaken attack on civil servants. What is it the civil service in general needs? Meg put digital and delivery. I mean, those are two of the big ones. I would add to that procurement skills. I mean, I think the civil service, and Treasury, sorry, that's where I worked a lot when I was a special advisor to Gordon Brown, but the civil service is poor at procurement. It knows it's poor at procurement. And there's always flirtation with the idea of centralising procurement in some way and having some sort of repository of expertise. How that has authority over the big procuring departments like the Ministry of Defence and others is a difficult question. But some move in that direction seems to be the right move. I just want to say something about 3 different things before I stop. The 3 big problems in the civil service, and I haven't been in government for over 10 years, like anyone in Labour, so this could be well out of date. But the 3 big problems to me are the Treasury, number 10, and the Cabinet Office. They're just small things, The Treasury problem is it's very, very powerful. It's not out of control. It's directed by chancellors who tell them what they want to do, and if the economy is in good health, they are incredibly powerful inside Whitehall. If they're not, they're less powerful. But one of the Treasury's biggest problems is if you work in the Treasury, 24-year-olds have unbelievable power at an incredibly young age. And then they go off at the age of 28 and go and work for McKinsey's or BCG or whatever else. The Treasury has an incredibly high turnover of very bright young people who are in charge of spending teams that have phenomenal amounts of power inside Whitehall in ways that no one ever sees. And then they go off and they have their careers. And I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but the retention of the young, brilliant class of people is a really important issue. But that doesn't seem to me systemically healthy for us as a country, to have people almost fresh out of university, however brilliant they are, having almost more power than they'll ever have in the rest of their careers if they stay in the civil service, let alone go elsewhere. That's one thing. Second thing is number 10. Number 10 is a real problem. I think personally the Office of the Prime Minister idea is a total disaster. Terrible idea, because the Prime Minister's office doesn't deliver anything. It's just not clear to me what an Office of the Prime Minister does. But number 10 is like a court, and it kind of has to be like a court. It's the point at which the different strands of government come to a head and decisions are made. And it's not clear to me that building a civil service department into number 10 is the right way to do it. But for me, the key thing in number 10 is for a Prime Minister in those areas that are priority for a government, as Meg said, you've got to work out your priorities for 100 days, a year, 2 years, 4 years. The Prime Minister has to be at the apex of the committees or the decision-making moments in the areas that express those priorities. And I've seen so many attempts at resolving cross-cutting issues, and again, Meg talked about like social housing or alcohol or issues that mental health, issues that cut across different departments. They fall away precisely because they don't have a champion outside of the ministerial departments. And the only person, in my view, who can do that is the Prime Minister. So one moral for the story for me would be that the Prime Minister has to lead cross-cutting missions in the 6 or 7 areas that are the ones that are priorities. What Tony Blair used to do is he used to every 6 weeks call the ministers in, like the Education Minister, Health Minister, and they'd have to account for how they're meeting their targets, not just in spending, but in delivery outcomes as well. And at that time, he got a lot of shit for it, to be honest. Number 10 was considered to be incredibly intrusive in the departments. But I actually think as a system of holding ministers to account for the few priorities you have, that's a pretty good way of doing it. And lastly, the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office, in my short time, well, unfortunately long time, in messing around in politics, has gone from being the Secretariat of Government to the place where Europe was sorted out because they didn't trust the Foreign Office to do it, to the Gordon Brown sort of internal think tank, to the place where all these cross-cutting bodies got lobbed into, a sort of messy rubbish bin of sort of different bits of government that didn't belong in the departments. Now it's sort of been flushed out again, and it's not clear what the Cabinet Office is going to be. The Cabinet Office, it should be the place where different parts of government connect with each other. That's the main function, it seems to me. And there needs to be, I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but some sort of review or approach to what the Cabinet Office's job is really important. Under Dominic Cummings, the Cabinet Office became incredibly important. Then there was this big yin-yang between number 10 and the Cabinet Office. Cabinet Office has a lot of power, has a lot of very bright people, has a lot of resource in it. No one knows what it does, and every new government basically changes the mission of the Cabinet Office. That is a disaster for central government, it seems to me. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Lord Wood. And it's almost as if he's been reading Policy Exchange's latest report, Reform, What Do We Want from the Next Prime Minister? And we have some quite interesting and out there ideas, I think, about how you might change the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, and Number 10's relationship with the rest of government. I'm now going to turn to Gabriel, who I think is joining us via Zoom. Look, we've had a lot here about, the politics of how it's all going. Nobody knows their way around Whitehall, perhaps better in the journalistic world than you do. I was wondering, from a sort of slight outsider's perspective, so to speak, what do you think the biggest problems are? Are there problems also around proprietary and ethics? I think is something that you're very interested in. And in particular, how you think the senior civil service operates and what can be done to perhaps hold senior mandarins and politicians themselves to account more.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to start by double-checking.
We can't. Sorry, Gabriel, we can't hear you. Oscar, couldn't turn that up, could we, by any chance?
2 seats at the front. I was standing at the back.
Okay, should we try again?
How's this?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I'm not sure our audience can. I tell you what, we'll come back to you, Gabriel, if that's okay. I think we just need to turn our speakers up. I'm going to turn to you, Richard, in the meantime. So one of the things I think is really clear is that very often there's a massive disconnect between the policy decisions made in government and the reality of services on the ground. Dame Meg touched very briefly on problems around digital government and coordination. I wondered whether, from your sort of experience dealing with central and local government, what you think can be done to improve that.
Yeah, thank you. listening to previous panelists, I think if we look at the evidence, the sort of case for reform is now more than ever. And that's not just with the issues of today, but it's how they're compounding the systemic issues of government. So if we look at things like the NHS wait times or the Crown Court case backlog, we know that if we don't change things, those issues are going to prevail. And those issues also define, in a way, what reform needs to achieve. So it can't just be about good ideas, it has to be about delivery, building on the previous points. It has to be about impact. It has to be about impact on real people, people in receipt of public service and people delivering public service. And because it's about real people, it has to happen with speed. It has to happen sort of now, not in many years to come. And Benjamin, as you mentioned, sort of Newton have had the pleasure of working with government and public bodies over the last 10 years to support exactly these sorts of issues. Supported over 50 health and care systems in supporting better outcomes for millions of people, different working practices for thousands of staff, and more sustainable working practices. And more recently, we've also worked in education, defence, justice and home affairs. And I think from that experience, we've picked up sort of 3 examples of 3 areas I think we reflect on that reform really needs to capture. So the first of those is that reform needs to think about how it empowers the front line in the delivery of change, and to your point, connecting policy ideas down to the front line. The second is that reform needs to connect impact and the outcomes. And then third is, how does reform use data to connect change and the outcomes for people? So just to talk briefly about each of those points in turn and build on other panelists. So the first point, government machinery in the 21st century is increasingly complicated. It's increasingly siloed and it spans multiple layers of government. And in our experience, that means that the sort of connection between ideas and delivery is increasingly long, and too often sort of good ideas don't translate to change on the ground. We need to invert the pyramid in this. Reform needs to think about how it empowers the front line, and the machinery of government builds in and supports the front line to enable them to deliver change that is impactful for them. And we're seeing some good examples of this in, for example, Department for Education's work with local authorities on special educational needs at the moment, where it's supporting them bottom up to build localised plans that are relevant to their context and they have confidence will deliver. On the second point around how reform needs to capture outcomes, again, because of the complex nature of the machinery of government at the moment, too often change is becoming focused on implementing a new structure or building new tools or defining new ways of working, rather than on the outcomes it's having for individuals. And I think a good case point for this is if we look at the sort of continual restructure of the NHS over the last 10 years, and sort of the different acronyms defining the structural form it's meant to embody, but meanwhile we're not seeing any real change in outcomes or patient impact. And then the last example, if we've got sort of the front line empowered to deliver change, if we've got sort of a clear definition of the outcomes we're trying to achieve, data is what enables us to connect those two things and to work at pace to have impact. Now, Policy Exchange, again, plugging your report, but Policy Exchange has made some great observations about what this needs to embody in the future. But if we look at sort of the system today, we've got the legacy IT issues, we've got sort of a growing risk-adverse nature to how we handle and use data, and we've got growing governance and bureaucracy around how we approve and sign off and manage data across the system. And too often that means that sort of the timely data, timely accurate data isn't getting into the hands of the people who need to use it to drive change at the front line. Now, COVID showed us that that didn't need to be the case, and things like the National Shielding Service enabled government to share data between local and central, between government departments, and between private organisations and the NHS to great effect to support the lives of millions of people during the early stages of COVID. So again, reform really needs to sort of bottle that and industrialise it and think about how that can expand across delivery and government to enable pace of delivery at scale. So I think if we just close, if we sort of can empower the front line, if we can be really clear on the outcomes we're trying to achieve and we can harness the power of data to let those things happen, then we can start to tackle things like the NHS waits, like the Crown Court backlogs, and really unlock the productivity of the public service.
Brilliant, thank you. And at a time of increasing public sector borrowing, which is perhaps a mild way of putting it, I think public sector productivity is going to come to the fore of every single policy discussion. So that's some really useful insights. I'm now, second time lucky, Gabriel, I think we've turned up the television. So here we go. Over to you.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we're there, we're going.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, everybody, for tolerating me being on Zoom. It's Jewish New Year today, so I've been in London. I've got a very glamorous day of synagogue in the morning and civil service reform in the afternoon. I'm not sure what's the sexier way to spend my time, but I will say actually, despite it's very easy when on the topic of civil service reform to be self-deprecating, but if you do look at some of the scandals and issues that have punctuated our news cycle over the last few years, the topic of the civil service and the relationship between officials and politicians is actually, I mean, obviously important, but also the subject of intense public interest. Benjamin and I actually bonded, became known to one another because of our mutual interest in the Greensill affair, or Greensill scandal. I'm not sure exactly how history recorded that episode. We'll go for the Greensill scandal then. Fast forwarding to the pandemic, there's been obviously huge scrutiny of, for instance, government handling of PPE shortages and the way in which it brought outsiders into the system in the midst of that crisis. And in many ways, I don't think it's too tenuous an interpretation of events to say that the scandal which felled Boris Johnson was one about behaviour that took place within the Cabinet Office in net number 10. And depending on how you take your tea, some would say it was the story of cabinet secretary and/or civil servants, being unable to prevent politicians from engaging in kind of inadequate and unethical behaviour, or indeed at times themselves joining in. Starting from that, then you mentioned, Benjamin, that I've taken an interest in ethics in public life, and only 48 hours ago we had a story on the minor detail of the most senior official in the British government not in fact being employed by the government, but rather being seconded from his lobbying company. These things matter, and they are and we are increasingly interested in them in the media. So just to reflect on a couple of points, I mean, I would say that I think I was going to be iconoclastic, and it's always my instinct. I guess lots of journalists have contrarian instincts. It's going to say, oh no, it's actually really far from it being the fault of politicians. Actually, all the problems we've identified in terms of the UK's underproductive and sluggish economy and all these scandals, it's all the officials' fault. What I will say is that I don't think obviously it would be an ideological, probably just inaccurate statement to claim that all officials are angels, and though it was digestible for the public to frame the Greensill scandal as the byproduct of David Cameron's predisposition towards the private sector and soft corruption, that whole phenomenon really was the result of the foremost civil servant in the country at the time, Jeremy Hayward, bringing in a young, thrusting Antipodean financier who nobody had heard of, but who he had taken a shining to. So it is, and I think that is, having reviewed many of the documents myself, I think that's a fair thing to say, even though I know many of his defenders were profoundly upset by the fact that he was unable to defend himself at the time the story broke. Nevertheless, to turn on a sixpence, I would say that I would definitely echo what Lord Wood said, which is that it's sort of so easy to reflexively blame officials for things. I just can't imagine I just think that there's been this meme going around Twitter of David Mitchell in one of his famous sketches saying, "Are we the Italians now?" in reference to just how quickly Britain is cycling through leaders at the moment. I just think that it is impossible for the civil service to give effect to radical policy change when the nature, scope, ambition, and character of that change, is upended every 10 minutes. And, we've gone from a big statist red Tory government to a small state, monetarist libertarian government. And, the civil service is already seemingly being preemptively blamed for it. We, witnessed the sacking of the permanent secretary of the Treasury. I just want to end with 2 points, ever so briefly, which is that there's something quite refreshing about the honesty and sincerity of what Liz Truss is seeking to do. Number one, the papers have characterised it as this great gamble. She has basically said that what the measures she's taking are going to unleash growth. She, unlike Boris Johnson, is not relying on the state to act as the incubator of growth. She's saying, let's roll back the frontiers of the state. Let's do less. Let's let the market and real life, ordinary human beings, not this unnecessary agglomeration of institutions that we call the state. Let's let people drive growth. So we'll have to see if it succeeds. But in parenthesis, she obviously wants to reduce the size of the civil service. So she's all sort of implicitly deproblematizing, or at least just deprioritizing the state as an agent of change. So notwithstanding the possibility that Labour get into government, it may be ironically that over the coming years, the civil service, by virtue of Truss's own ideology, ends up playing a slightly less significant or politically prominent role.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, I think, very even-handed contribution, Gabriel. I'm going to turn now back to Dame Meg. I just thought I'd pick your brains on a couple of the themes that have come up here. The issue of cross-working and perhaps the over-empowerment of Her Majesty's Treasury is one of the key things to come out of it. So there's a really good question about how the centre of government can work with other parts of government effectively. And another thing I'd also quite like to hear your thoughts on, given that you mentioned it with public appointments. But I wondered what you had to say, perhaps some of the contributions from the rest of the panel, and whether those chimed with some of your observations chairing the Public Accounts Committee over the last few years.
Absolutely, and I think this idea of process taking priority over outcomes is so often what we see when we look at things that have gone wrong with the civil service. That, in fact, an example was Grant Shapps had a habit of announcing things in a press release, and then the civil service, poor them, had to then come up with a policy to deliver it. That is going to Lord Wood's point very much about how don't blame the civil servants. A lot of them, not they don't always get it right, but they have to go with what politicians tell them. And in this case, it was actually my first hearing as chair of the PAC. He had announced that government would release enough land to build 100,000 new homes, enough public land. And he'd announced this and announced it would create a certain number of jobs and a certain number of homes, and nothing had been delivered. But the civil servant in front of us said it was a huge success, the programme that she delivered, because she had to go back, or her predecessor had, and build up and find the land that was going to deliver this 100,000 new homes. They'd actually gone back as far as 1997, so it rather demonstrated the impossibility of the task. But the process was a success for the civil service, but actually, it was an amazing moment, and as first-time chair of the committee, all members of all parties rose up and going, but hang on, can any of my constituents put a key in the door of a new home yet? No, so it hasn't been a success, but that was because our measure of success was clearly the practical reality of something that makes a difference to people's lives, and the civil service was drawn into the process. That's partly because of how that policy was forged. One of the things that we've talked about is ministers' decisions. Of course, ministerial directions is something that maybe not everyone's aware of. This is when the senior civil servant, the accounting officer, that's just the permanent secretary, has to, if something doesn't meet the normal spending rules, which seem to have, well, who knows whether they've been ripped up by this government, but they have to abide by certain key rules, which are increasingly cited to us as a committee. They take it very seriously. If it doesn't meet those rules, they have to ask the minister for a direction. So we've seen a few more of those. It's something that actually Lord Maud has been pushing for. There's good things about that, because it does say sometimes it's really clear the politicians made the decision, has told the civil service to do it regardless of value for money. There were a lot at the beginning of COVID because it was the end of the financial year, and suddenly accounting officers will have to sign off amounts of spending that was just not possible to sign off in the last week of the financial year. So that was understandable. But if they become too frequent, then it can be a real problem, because it's just the civil service being told what to do, even though it doesn't stack up. So there's a kind of balance there, and there's a whole other discussion really to have about that. But in terms of cross-party working, I think it is interesting about these young people in the Treasury. I actually have some of them visit my surgery because it's a sort of way of them seeing the real interaction of policy on the ground. And they are quite sometimes wide-eyed about what they see when what they're doing hits real life. But I think the Cabinet Office can have a role. And I think there's a really important debate we've got to have, haven't we, Stuart, about what a Labour government would do with the Cabinet Office. Very often it's driven by the personality that's in charge. And we've got a strong personality in Angela. Angela Rayner, of course, is our Cabinet Office lead at the moment. And I think we've got to think what it does. But if it comes in and just tries to tell departments what to do, I mean, I've had examples of permanent secretaries sit in front of me and say, are you going to do this thing that's being proposed by central government? And sometimes they just look at you with a kind of cocky look in their eye and go, well, no way, basically, because we don't want to, we don't need to. We're a big enough spending department to do it our own way. And when you've got that approach, it's not very helpful. So it actually has to be, the Cabinet Office has got to also forge a relationship between politicians. So whether it's the Prime Minister that's at the apex of that, or it's just a team spirit approach. Hazel Blears did an amazing job getting everybody to work together to deliver some agendas and get money from different departments to help local government deliver on some of our agendas. But boy, she sweated her political capital on that. And there is, and then that's a lot of work. And frankly, when you've also got, let's say you're Home Secretary and you're dealing with a passport crisis and an immigration crisis and you're in defence and you've got the idea that you're all going to have the energy, and that's so we have to go in, I think, as a Labour government with a very clear mission and be really clear that then the civil service will then support that, exactly as Stuart said. And just public appointments. I've been doing a bit of monitoring of public appointments, and I recommend you do this. There's a government website that has all the public appointments up. If you look at who's on those panels, there's usually a quite junior civil servant. Then there's somebody from the organisation involved, sometimes with a political background because there've already been a lot of people with certain political backgrounds being appointed. And then some other random person's often put on. And if you do 2 clicks through Google, you will find that they've got strong political connections. And I've been in a room with people who didn't understand that if you knocked on a door for a major political party in December 2019, you were probably pretty active, whichever party that may be. And I think we've got to really watch this. I don't think there's a problem about having people with a political input involved in public jobs, but they have to be qualified for them. And I don't think we should go in and put lots of Labour-placed people into jobs, just as they are putting lots of Conservative-placed people who are not qualified into those jobs. And I think that also means that people then back off, say, I'm not applying for that. The civil service actually aren't always aware of what's being done underneath them. And I think that there's a real concern about the probity of public life and about people who are there just to deliver on a job. And I think, when people start in some of those bodies that are key public appointments dancing to the tune of their political masters, that's not helpful. I've been a minister, I had a real privileged role in the Home Office, and I know that I want someone who will challenge me. If I was in that position again, or I think any of our front bench would want that, not someone who just goes, yes, whatever you want. You actually want someone who will give you the professional advice you need to make the difficult decisions. And the people I've worked with over the years were very willing to do that if you gave them the permission to do it. Which brings me to I think the final point on this is that you've got to have a culture which says we can be challenged. And if going in new with a whole exciting agenda of what we want to do as a Labour government in the first 100 days, it might be hard to hear that actually that's quite difficult, Minister. But you need to have that, you need to hear what the problems are going to be before you can finally forge ahead so that you know what issues they're going to be in delivery, because the delivery is political as well as through the civil service.
Oh, that's a really, really great contribution. Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to quickly, I promise I will open this up to questions in a minute, but I'm just going to ruthlessly abuse my position as chair and go back to Stuart. I think one of the things that's really come out here is the role of central government, and in particular the structure of the Cabinet Office. And you spoke about it briefly, but I might ask you perhaps to elaborate slightly more on that particular question. And the other thing I'd also really love to hear about is what you thought the perhaps balance between accountability between ministers and politicians were. So it might not be sort of known to everybody in the room, but Policy Change's founder, Lord Maud, is currently undertaking a review of civil service accountability, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what comes through that process. We have had an increase in the use of ministerial directions, and there's an interesting case to be had around that. And it also came to the public appointments point that Meg has just made, which is that in light of the 2016 Grimston review and the implementation of its recommendations, ministers do now have a strengthened role in public appointments. And I wondered whether you thought that we'd got that balance right, or whether an incoming Labour government might need to change that.
I think the balance is totally wrong. And I totally agree with Meg that it's really important when Labour gets in that we don't just say, right, they had their chance of appointing their own cronies in the state, in Quangos and everywhere else. We'll do the same now in reverse. I think it's such a temptation, but it's really important to refuse it because, you basically, Gabriel talked about this as well. It's understandable that ministers want to bring in external people. I think that's completely understandable. That's why the special advisor class, which I was obviously a small part of, it emerged in the last 30, 40 years because They wanted people who had more political grounding with their party, could make decisions which had political sides to it, but also understand the policy. And the funny thing is, when it works well, it doesn't always work well, civil servants want special advisors because they need protection from people who understand the politics, so they don't come up with policies which are not in the land of the living politically. So when it works well, I'm not saying it always does, the connection between civil servants, special advisors and ministers actually can be quite functional and good for the civil service. But it's quite understandable ministers want to bring in external people. But what's happened is there are no rules about the terms on which people are brought in as external people. You know, it goes back all the way to Nicky Caldor being brought in by Harold Wilson in the 60s, and Thatcher bringing in Alan Walters, and departments bringing in people as, you know, putting people in the civil service as special advisors, even though, sorry, specialist advisors, not special advisors, but actually they're special advisors, right? That game has been played now for a while. But what happens is, because there are no rules, you get the green seal kind of problem, right? You get, and rightly, in particular, number 10, the Treasury have, under both Labour and Tory governments, worried about the lack of people with business, economic, practical skills in senior roles. So it's understandable you want to bring in people who've had business expertise. The problem with coming from a business background is if you've still got business interests, then you are suddenly no longer an honest broker when it comes to performing a public role. And I don't think it's just virtue signal to say it's an absolute outrage that the chief of staff of the prime minister is paid by a lobbying company, as Gabriel said. We should be furious about this. I mean, I saw, you know, Twitter is a weird world, but when that story came out, loads of people said, well, so what, as long as he does a good job. No, it's not okay. It's not okay. Because you can't, the rules are there, even if things go well. The point of rules is to ensure propriety and trust in public office for the minority of cases when abuse does happen and corruption does happen. So I think we need to stop this Wild West system of people being randomly brought in under the pretense of kicking groupthink up the backside and challenging. You can challenge, but observe rules about the terms on which people come in much better. And just quickly on the Cabinet Office, sorry. Cabinet Office has become this sort of dumping ground for all sorts of projects that your predecessor did. So the first thing Liz Truss seems to have done is chuck a lot of people from number 10 into the Cabinet Office because she doesn't want them in number 10 anymore. So it has no rhyme or reason as an organisation. But it goes back to Meg's early point that there are so many issues in government that don't fit neatly into one department. And if the Cabinet Office has any function, it's to try and connect those tissues. The weakness of the Cabinet Office is that it doesn't really have a big beast minister usually there. Or if it does, they don't have the authority to bang the health minister and education minister's heads together when they conflict on things. And that's the sort of governance problem that needs to be sorted out if the Cabinet Office is to be genuinely the connecting tissue inside Whitehall, it seems to me.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, on the question of external appointments to government, I thought I'd just quickly highlight Policy Exchange's November 2020 report, or 2021 perhaps, Open, Meritocratic and Transparent, which set out how you can strengthen the role of the Civil Service Commission to try and ensure that there's propriety around appointments. Just quickly before opening it up to audience questions, I'm going to turn to Gabriel then. There must have been lots there in Lord Ward's response that was music to your ears. I just wondered whether we could just quickly turn to your thoughts on that.
I mean, absolutely. I do think that, I mean, one of the most striking illustrations of the phenomenon which Lord Wood was referring to over there was a story which we did about a year or so ago, which the then Conservative Party chairman, Ben Elliott, was just explicitly encouraging a high net worth individual and party donor to apply for an admittedly not particularly high profile public role. I think heading up, I think it would perhaps be on the board of the big lottery fund, or not sort of saying sitting on the monetary policy committee or being a non-executive director of Whitehall Department, albeit there have been lots of instances of political appointees doing the latter. I think that you're quite right that it's a kind of reflex for lots of governments to want to bring in external expertise. There's clearly nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's actually, on the contrary, I mean, I'm sure vitally important. I think that not to be too po-faced or self-righteous about it. I just think that we probably deserve to know who's going in, when, how, and who, if anybody, in the corridors of power in the government or the Conservative Party has been advocating for people getting those roles. I mean, I'm not saying that somebody with who's politically aligned to the Conservative Party happening to sit on the board of a government department is itself a problem. I think we just need to know about it. And I know that sound, one case I would just point to as well. I don't think most people, even in SW1, knew this. And as a journalist, you always have stories that you feel deserve to have more impact than they did. And, your genius was just slightly lost on the world on that occasion. But I do remember doing a series of stories on the fact that Lord Udley Lister, Boris Johnson's principal strategic advisor, was literally on the payroll of a property developer throughout his time in Number 10. I bet plenty of people here didn't particularly know that. It's okay. You don't have to all be studious readers of His Majesty's Sunday Times, but I do think that there are times where the press, perhaps the only people banging on about some of these things, which, as Lord Wood said, sort of should make you pretty angry. The public, the press are entitled to know these things, and I do hope that we see a turn towards transparency, in the years to come. Now that it has become quite a politically damaging issue.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. I'm going to open it up to audience questions. I know there are people champing at the bit, but I'm conscious that we also need to have another question directed at Richard. So if there's anybody with a question for him, I thought we might start with them. And then, okay, we'll go with you, sir, just there. And then we'll do them in batches of 3, if that's okay, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Right, Barry Pembroke. My question...
Oh, just quickly, I was going to say, please state your name and organisation. That's our one. No question is too outrageous, but please do state your name and organisation.
Barry Pembroke, actually NHS. When a Labour government comes in, they'll probably spend the first few years reforming legislation, repealing acts, and introducing new legislation, which could take a few years. So my question to change countries' fortunes around, especially in areas like justice, education and welfare. So my question to the panel is, what can Parliament do to speed things up in approving legislation, and what can civil servants do to deliver at pace and make things happen?
Awesome, thank you. And we're going to take 2 more questions, if that's possible. So, yeah, do you want to go to you there? You've got the mic, I think.
Thanks very much. I was happily handed the mic. I'm Sophie Danreiter from the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. And I've heard from Stuart and from Gabriel a bit about accountability or lack of accountability and the tendency to play or to want to play the blame game. When talking about resilience to the biggest risks we face and thinking about how government could or should do risk management, I've heard it described as a bit of a happy fudge the way it is currently. And I wondered what Labour should be doing to ensure proper accountability so that we're properly prepared for the biggest risks we face.
Brilliant, thank you. And if we could have the gentleman in the sort of jacket just there, thank you.
Thank you. And it builds nicely on that, actually, because I'm Alex Thomas from the Institute for Government. It seems to me, and it ran through a lot of what the panel said, there are assumptions that the civil service has more authority than it actually does, whether it's over the ethics of a Prime Minister doing things he perhaps shouldn't be, or public appointments, or also over the management of big policy programmes. But at the same time, as Meg in particular said, there's a push for more consistency, more authority for the civil service on things like digital over the long term, or contingency planning resilience would be another one. So I wonder how a Labour government, how the panel would resolve the democratic oversight of the civil service while having longer term planning more embedded into the state.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm going to quickly start with that question about delivering things at speed with Richard, and I might turn with the other questions to the rest of the panel.
I'm glad you picked that question. I think the point that comes to mind in your specific example about delivery at pace within the NHS, I think the NHS is a really good example where there is a wealth of data and a lot of data that can be pointed to the outcomes that are being achieved for people having access to those services. And I think the question for me is, when you look at the broad landscape of how should we structure the NHS, what policies should we put in place, do we need different acts going through Parliament to make that happen? If we can't very quickly link those things through to the evidence that suggests how it's going to have an impact, then it's not going to happen at pace. So I think there's a question to some of the other points on the panel around how civil servants interact with new ministers as they come in to make the case around the evidence that exists in these things and says, yes, understandably, there's lots of other areas we may want to push, but is the evidence pointing to how this is actually going to have an impact for people who access and use these services? And that has to be a priority, right? And I'm sure will be sort of taken into account in the delivery of these things.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'd just quickly highlight for those interested in reform of the NHS Policy Exchange, our event tomorrow at 10:15, and I urge you all to come and listen to Policy Exchange's ambitious plans to deliver more delivery and change in healthcare. I'm going to turn now to Dame Meg. I wondered what you made of those particular questions and if there was a particular area you wanted to touch upon.
I think one of the challenges is on Acts of Parliament and repealing them. That can take up an awful lot of time, and I think given it'll. If we get in next time, it's going to be fragile. It's going to be a lot we've got to do. We want to make change. And if we spend all our time repealing acts, there's a point where you have to accept to a degree, unbelievably, given what's been happening, what government has done already. You can't spend all your time repealing acts of Parliament. So we need to be focused. And actually, the other thing, and I'd say to anyone in this room who's got any connections anywhere, we need to do things that don't require passing legislation. So for instance, when Ed Miliband was leader just before the 2015 election, we met with the Council of Mortgage Lenders to talk about I wasn't a shadow minister in that area or anything, but we were having a round table, and they were very happy to have longer tenancies. So that's something, if you sabre rattle enough in government, we're going to legislate unless you do this. Well, very often sectors will find a way of doing it. It may not be perfect, but you have to have plan A as the perfect Labour government. You're probably working to plan B or plan C or maybe even plan D to get, because of what we'll be inheriting. And remember, there will be no money by the time we get there. 18 months, they're spending us dry. On the resilience and risk, we should probably connect, because we're looking at this a lot on the Public Accounts Committee, and the National Audit Office has been focusing a lot on this. Everyone thinks they won't be standing when the music stops. This government was when COVID happened. We've got Parliament about to burn down, and I don't joke, and everyone thinks it's not going to be them. And we think on the Public Accounts Committee there needs to be a government risk officer like you would have in a bank. A bank would be shut down if you weren't dealing with these risks, and there is no similar requirement on the public sector. The civil service is very averse to this, interestingly. They say, well, you couldn't have a risk officer tell the chief medical officer what to do. We go, you don't understand what a risk officer does. So there's a real discussion to be had there. And actually, that's a good leads into this thing of long-term projects and what should be the civil services domain and what should be a democratic domain. And actually, we used to have more consensus, didn't we? But how can anybody say it's not right to improve a 1970s computer database? How can anyone say that actually we need to be better prepared for the next pandemic? The danger is, and I remember when I was a minister in the Home Office and oversaw science, among other things, there was a push on the budget, of course, there always is. Let's cut the social science budget. And I said, if you do that, ministers coming down the line in 10 and 20 years' time will have broken the chain of research, and they won't have information to go back on. I fear it got through anyway, because it's an easy cut to make, and that's what we've got to somehow, and it's very difficult to codify how you do that, isolate what needs to be done, because it's just got to be done for the citizen, and what is the political choice. And actually, I have been having quite interesting conversations with senior civil servants, worried about putting things up to their minister in case they say, well, we're just not going to do that because that's going to cost too much money, even though if they stop something for 2 years, it completely puts it backwards and you'll never really catch up again on something. So, we've got to have an agreement, and I don't know, there is no answer to that in the current. We thought the coalition was unstable didn't we, when it arrived, but boy, it's been so challenging since. So, yeah, there is no easy answer to that one.
Brilliant. I'm just going to quickly turn. Actually, let's take 3 more questions because we've only got 5 minutes left. But if there are questions you've heard, Gabriel and Lord Wood, that you want to ask, then let's do that. So if we go to the gentleman in the front row, then we'll come to those round the back.
George Perrotts, KC of the Society of Labour Lawyers. I spent quite a lot of time over the last 30 years doing public law cases for the government, and I have 2 particular concerns at the moment. One is a catastrophic decline in record keeping. When I started advising the government, you got files that high which told you the whole story of what had happened. You could read up. You downloaded effectively the entire history of the matter, and you were on top of it. It's almost impossible to do that now, and certainly cases I get involved in, and at my level those tend to be ones where either something has gone wrong or somebody is very, very cross indeed. It is often quite difficult to find out actually who took the decision sometimes and why it was taken. And if you don't
I'm just going to quickly hurry you if that's the case.
If you don't know why a decision was taken, you can't find out what went wrong and you can't learn from it. And the second point I was going to make is that there's been, and this is a more recent problem, that there has been an atmosphere, certainly from the current government, that they don't want to hear, and this is a message that has gone out to government lawyers, that they do not want to hear inconvenient legal advice. And that is something that is a Labour government is going to have to change. And one very short point on Meg's, there's an intermediate solution between primary legislation and no legislation at all. You use statutory instruments.
Yeah.
And one thing the current government has done is it's given a huge arsenal of statutory instrument powers
all those
that
COVID
the
ones.
Labour ministers can use.
Brilliant. And also, I'd also point out that in 2006, Tony Blair passed a particular act that gave ministers the power to use legislative reform orders. So this is not a new phenomenon. I'm going to quickly go to the gentleman at the back with the glasses, and then I'm going to come down the line.
Hello, Henry Dyer at The Guardian. This is a real hobby horse for me, but I'd be really interested in getting the panel's thoughts on what a Labour government would do in terms of changing, we talked about how the civil service would change how it works, but actually changing the civil service, revealing how it works. So effectively the Freedom of Information Act, which is becoming increasingly difficult to use and sort of links into George's points. I mean, if the records even do exist, it becomes nigh on impossible to get them sometimes, because either it seems, it's unclear for me, sort of, is it that ministers don't want this information revealed, or is it actually deeper that civil servants don't want information disclosed sometimes?
Brilliant, thank you, that's such a great question. If we could come to you, Tessa, and then we're going to quickly go around, I think, and try to finish on time.
Yes, Nigel Fletcher from the Centre for Opposition Studies and King's College London. I'm also on the Advisory Council for National Records and Archives. There's some conversations I'm going to be having after this.
And the convening power of policy exchange wins again.
I was wondered, with an incoming government coming in from opposition, I wonder how important you think it is for now shadow ministers to sort of be trained in what Whitehall can do, the best way of working with civil servants. Some of that obviously can be done in induction, but I know the Institute for Government does a lot of work with potential ministers. What's the best way of doing that, and how important is it?
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to go to Gabriel first. I don't know which of those questions took your fancy. I suspect you'll go for freedom of information request before I'll come across to Lord Wood, and then we might do some 1-minute summaries from the speakers.
I mean, I do think that the proliferation of information and the changes that we've witnessed since the introduction of the Freedom of Information Act to the way that we all correspond would in and of itself necessitate the updating of legislation, or at least guidance surrounding it. But then there is the sort of willful vandalisation of FOI legislation and that we've witnessed over the last decade, which actually I think every national newspaper editor has written to the government to object to. Basically, neither civil servants nor the people to whom they answer, namely ministers, are in the slightest interest in revealing what they do. And I have civil service sources whose opinion I'm really grateful for, in that they say, some of the time we literally, admittedly don't really want you to know what we're up to, don't want you to lift the bonnet up. Other times they say it's just an utter encumbrance and wastes lots of their time and prevents them from doing operational stuff. The view I'm naturally sceptical of, but I'm happy to at least take in good faith. I think the proof in putting from Labour's perspective will be, are they weaponising the issue of the FOI Act and cronyism and democracy because it helps add definition to this idea that the Conservatives are out of touch and don't care about you? Or are they kind of morally in policy terms? I mean, do they believe in the intrinsic value of transparency and achieving better government? I bet it's not an issue that Keir Starmer spends lots of time thinking about before he goes to sleep. I guess it's never a priority for an incoming administration to liberalise transparency laws. So we will have to see. But there's plenty of reason to be a little bit sceptical that any government would invite more scrutiny on themselves. And just to go back to Greensill, I do remember that Labour were sort of decidedly disinterested in the Hayward civil service dimension of that particular Farrago. Why would they care about a sadly now deceased senior Mandarin? It just doesn't align with their ideological interpretation of the government as it exists today. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm not sure whether I'm optimistic or not, but
Amazing, thank you. So we've got another event at 5:15, so I'm just going to quickly go to Lord Wood, perhaps for 60 seconds on some of those other questions.
On your point about risk, I mean, Brexit's a good example. I mean, why was Whitehall so unprepared for the Brexit decision? Because David Cameron's government told the civil service not to do any preparation for it. Why? Not because, well, partly because they thought they'd win, but mostly because they didn't want anything to leak. And this paranoia about leaks, and by the way, the government at the moment is right to worry about leaks because the leaks are, I mean, the volume of leaking has gone through the roof in the last 5 years. So that is a conundrum with the tension between FOI and civil servants who have who want to be able to do their job properly. I'm just going to say 3 institutional innovations, some of which I actually believe in, to throw out. One is Australia, I believe, and someone else will know much more about this than I, have just brought in some kind of off-gov, some sort of office whose job is to monitor the transparency, probity of the way central government works. You can imagine that sort of thing with a, I mean, I would like the standards code to be enforced by an off-gov rather than the Prime Minister decide whether or not to enforce the standards code inside government. You can imagine that, and also you could have a view with regard to the human resources needs of government as well. You could think about. Second thing, I've always been a fan, you can think this is mad, I've always been a fan of the idea of after an election there being a kind of 2-week period when the Gus O'Donnell rules from 2010 kick in, so the Prime Minister who's lost, let's say he's lost the election, can't make any big decisions, but you have a 2-week period where the new cabinet actually gets a bit of training before they start their jobs. It's absolutely insane that at 4 in the morning you find out you won, and 7 a.m. you walk through the door to a fanfare of paparazzi. I mean, it's completely crazy. So that's, and the last idea is, I have a friend who worked on Operation London Bridge, which we all know about now, and some of you may know this, a number of times, but in particular 6 months ago, there was a 10-day period when the entire Cabinet Office and other parts of government were doing real-time planning of different scenarios. She was getting a call saying, oh, the Queen, it's a horrible thing to say, the Queen's coffin is here, and we can't get it on a plane, and you had to then, it turns out one of the things they planned was on almost exactly the unfortunate scenario that did happen about the Queen passing away in Balmoral. And so the scenario planning and putting civil servants in actual case study scenarios is a really important part. And as Meg says, let alone risk, they don't do any of this, really. I mean, there's hardly any. The Treasury does a bit on catastrophic economic moments, which could be quite useful at the moment. But on the whole, it doesn't happen very much, and that's a real problem for risk and resilience.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Well, what's brilliant is clearly there is so much more for us to talk about. Policy Exchange is always the ones who are pushing this agenda and really trying to drive it forward. And it's great that there are so many people in this room who clearly have a passion for it as well. So I'd like to thank our panellists for coming along today, and hopefully we can work with them more to inform what a future Labour government might do. I'd like to thank those at home, and I'd like to particularly thank Gabriel for joining us via Zoom. It's been great to have you. Thank you all for coming, and to thank our IT team for setting up. So thank you very much, and do engage with us here at Policy Exchange. Thank you.